Now, as I continue in my reading, I'm coming to these periods of fairly significant historical events between sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, such as when I read section 111, which was in August of 1836, and then section 112 was July 1837, nearly a year later. Now, I did cover that year briefly in the beginning of my reading of section 112. But now we come to another such historical period. This is after section 112, which was given July 27th of 1837. Our next reading will be section 113, which is given in March of 1838. That is about 8 months later. And there is a fairly significant amount of stuff happening at this time, in these 8 months. And I don't want to spend too much time on it in my regular reading, so I am going to discuss it here in this video, then return to the reading. Now, as I said, section 112 was July 27th of 1837. There are a number of things going on here. Remember that the mission to England has happened. They have gone to England. Matter of fact, the same day that that revelation is given, July 27th, is the first day that the missionaries in England preach the gospel. They arrive in England a few days earlier. I think they arrived on the 24th or 25th in Liverpool. They traveled to Preston, and this is where they preach. Now, there were 6 missionaries on this journey. I cannot recall all their names at this time, but Orson Hyde and Kimball, Heber C. Kimball, were the 2 apostles who were presidents of this mission to open up the work in England. With them, I believe, was Willard Richards, Brother Goodson, and Joseph Fielding. I cannot remember the 6th man's name. Joseph Fielding had been born and raised in England, but had moved to Canada. And it was in the early 1830s that him and his family first met missionaries of the church. They were actually a member of a Methodist congregation, along with John Taylor, who became the 3rd president of the church. They were known as the Dissenters because while they were still nominally Methodist, they had severe issues with the Methodist doctrine, and so they had formed a kind of quasi-church organization. And almost all the members of these dissenters did join the church and move to Kirtland. Now, Joseph Fielding was one, and he had 2 sisters, Mary Fielding and Martha Fielding. Mary Fielding would eventually, I believe in 1837, in 1838, she would marry Hiram Smith, and is the mother of Joseph Fielding Smith and the grandmother of Joseph F. Smith, 2 other presidents of the church. Now, Joseph Fielding, the rest of his family was back in England. There were 7 children total born to a John Fielding, and all of them had gone into the ministry of some Christian denomination. Episcopals, Church of England, Methodists, they were all there. 7 of them had remained in England. One of his sisters had married a Methodist minister by the name of Matthews, Reverend Matthews. So when they get to England, the first place they go is Preston, because that is where Joseph Fielding's brother James Fielding is a minister. I believe he's a minister in the Episcopal Church. And they go to his church, and they sit in the congregation. They are guests. They listen to James give his preaching in the morning. And then James, without request, without being asked, he simply makes the announcement that there are some American preachers here, and he is going to open the pulpit to them for the afternoon meeting. So they have the morning meeting, they break for lunch, and then the congregation returns, and I think it was Brother Kimball explained the rise and history of the church up to that point, and then Brother Hyde, he bore testimony of the church. Afterwards, James Fielding said, okay, we're going to have a 3rd meeting this evening for anybody who wants to come back again. And 2 of the other brethren, I can't remember who it was, I believe Brother Goodson was one of them, but 2 others spoke. And that even on this first day, there was great warm feelings to the message. Many of the congregation were very interested and could feel and testified that they could feel the truthfulness of what these men were teaching. James Fielding, though, he got a little annoyed because he was worried about losing his congregation. Because at this time, a preacher's income was based largely on how large his congregation was, because his income was based on the donations and the tithing of the congregation. So if you had a small congregation, you had a small income. But if you had a larger congregation, especially a wealthy congregation, you got more money. And so after this initial preaching, he threw the elders out, including his brother Joseph, and became very antagonistic, very oppositional to the church. And so the members started inviting the elders to come to their individual homes and teach them in their own homes. And this irritated James Fielding to no end. And he started accusing them. I love the accusation was thieves and what he called sheep stealing. And he was stealing his congregation. These were his sheep. This was his flock in the ministry. They were stealing his. See, at this time, there was a kind of an understanding, not as much in America. America had a lot of contentions between denominations. But in England, there was a general understanding that the individuals chose what congregation to attend, and the ministers did not actively seek to draw members away from another congregation. You had your congregation, if people who wanted to come and attend your church, that was on them, but you did not go out and actively seek to draw them to your church. And that is what is meant by sheep stealing. He is accusing them of actively seeking to draw people away from his congregation. Of course, technically they were, but it just seems kind of it's a silly accusation, but it is one being made at this time. And he even said that they had good judgment because they stole all of his best members. So shortly after this initial preaching in Preston, though, the 6 brethren would separate into 3 different missions. Now, just before this, actually, it was shortly after this first meeting. They were still in Preston, and I think it was Goodson, but no, it was one of the other. I can't remember his name. It was one of the other ones. Came to Orson Hyde and Heber C. Kimball and told them he was planning on going and preaching in a public square, the first public preaching that they were going to have. And he felt beset by devils. And he went to the apostles and asked them to bless him because he was in such torment. He said, if I don't get relief, it's going to kill me. And so the 2 apostles put their hands on his head and blessed him. And when they did, the devils transferred to Heber C. Kimball. And he said a physical force smacked him and knocked him senseless. And when he came to, he was being blessed by the other 2 men. And he was in such torment, he could barely stand. And they laid him down on the bed, but he said he needed relief. And so he kind of rolled out of bed onto his knees and prayed to God for relief. All 3 of the men who were there, I believe Willard Richards came in near the end of this, and they all said that they could see the devils surrounding them, gnashing their teeth, trying to prevent these men from preaching the gospel. But they go out on their missions. One pair, they separate 2 and 2, so 3 missions. And one, led by Goodson, goes to Bedford, I believe is the name, or Bradford, something like that. And that is where the sister of Joseph Fielding is with her husband, Reverend Matthews. At first there's a little hostility there, and Goodson he does go against the apostles' counsel by reading certain revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that without a trained faith can come off kind of odd, and it hindered the work. But at the same time, Reverend Matthews starts publicly endorsing the message, starts endorsing the gospel, saying that these men are right. He even makes an appointment to be baptized at the river, but he does not show up. And a day or 2 later, he goes preaching instead, and a day or 2 later, he baptizes himself in the river, publicly denounces the apostles, denounces the elders, tells them they are all fallen and devilish, but then tries to set up a church on the same gospel, preaching the exact same doctrine. And this gives me the impression that he was again trying to maintain his congregation, his flock of sheep, because he didn't want to lose people, just like James. But a lot of people eventually did join the church, despite the misstep of Elder Goodson. But we have in the 3rd mission field, a brother Watts was the first one to be baptized, but there was a sister Richards. She was the daughter of another minister, and she is baptized and confirmed. So she's the second baptism, first confirmation. She then goes back to her father and convinces her father to invite these missionaries to come to his congregation and teach the people. And eventually, he actually tells his congregation, these men are teaching the truth. You all need to pay attention. He doesn't order them to join the church, but he does say, you need to listen to this. Do what you feel is right, but I'm telling you, this is the true gospel. So that is the beginning of the British mission, the mission in England. And in the record of Joseph Smith, in his history, he writes a lot about it for the rest of this year, 1837. But he doesn't tell us anything else about it until after we read the next few sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. So we're going to leave this history of the English mission here. Let us talk about what's going on among the church in Kirtland and Missouri. First of all, there are 3 apostles who are disfellowshipped for unchristian-like behavior, and they are stripped of their apostleship. This is John F. Boynton and Luke and Lyman Johnson. And they are told, if they will confess, then they will be brought back into the church. Their main complaint is the failure of the Kirtland Banking Society, or the Safety Society. It is not yet closed, but it is struggling, and the depression that is sweeping through the country is causing many institutions to close. But they say that they were told, or at least Boynton, he says that he was told that the Safety Society could never fail because God was behind it, which Joseph Smith soundly denounces. Says, I've never said that. I said that if it was conducted on principles of righteousness, it couldn't fall. But it hasn't been conducted on principles of righteousness, and so we have no guarantee. Now, about a week later, these 3 men are able to make a sufficient satisfaction to the church and the High Council, and they are re-fellowshipped into the church. I don't know if they're ever given their apostleship back, but they are re-fellowshipped into the church. During this time, there is also a reorganization of the High Council and the Quorum of the 70. Mainly because the High Council is reorganized because a number of the men have moved out to Missouri. Some of them are on missions, and they just need to get a new High Council set up. They also have a sustaining of the First Presidency and the rest of the Quorum of the 12. All of this is being done with the Quorum of the 70. One reason it is reorganized is that all those who have been ordained high priests are removed from the Quorum and replaced with those who are elders, because the Council of 70, the Quorum of 70 is taken from the elders. The apostles are all high priests, but the Quorum of 70 is supposed to be all elders. Now, this all happens in September. The disfellowshipping of the apostles and their being reinstated in fellowship and the reorganizing of the quorums, all of that happens in September, after which Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and a few others head out to Missouri. And on November 3rd, so it was done September 3rd, I believe, in Kirtland, but November 3rd, 2 months later, they have the members out there are called to sustain all the quorums again and sustain everything that happened in Kirtland. The only thing that they do not sustain is they refuse to sustain Frederick G. Williams as the second counselor in the First Presidency. Now, he was sustained in Kirtland, but not with a unanimous vote. There were a few people who were voting against him. And when the people in Missouri also vote against him, he is removed from that position and replaced by Hiram Smith. A few other things to mention in this interim here during September and October is in September again, late September, the membership in Kirtland is tallied. There are 109 men of an age to serve a mission, and they are organized into 8 companies and sent out into various mission fields in the United States and Canada, I believe. And so we have this, actually, before this, it was just, these men are called to go east, these men are called to go west, these men are called to go, there was no real organization. It was just, these men are called to go preach where the Spirit leads you. This time, they are organized into these 8 companies, and they are given a specific mission field. And they're said, this is where your company is going to go. Now, it is 8 companies, so they are at 109 divided by 8 would be about 16 about 13 on average. 13 on average per company. So they're going out as a group to their mission field, and then they will divide off and preach in various areas. And we have this first formally organized mission. A little later in October, Hiram Smith's first wife, Jerusha, dies. Now, they had 6 children together. Some records I have seen say that only 5 were living at the time that she died. Some say that all 6 were. I'm not quite sure on that, but they had 6 children together. She dies, and it's about a year later, I think it's in 1838, that he will remarry Mary Fielding. But now we get to the juicy part, because in November, in mid to late November, the Kirtland Safety Society fails completely and is shut down. In response to this, John F. Boynton, Lyman, and Luke Johnson, as well as Warren Parrish and others, go into full apostasy. They split from the church. They declare themselves to be the true church, calling themselves the Church of Christ instead of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And they formally organize their dissensions, and they start stirring up mob action against Joseph Smith and those who are faithful. Particularly Brigham Young, because Brigham Young really gets after him when they start doing this. He lays into them good. And so they begin. This is when the persecution of the saints ran. I mean, there's always been some persecution, especially in Missouri, but even in Kirtland, there's always some mild persecution. But now we're starting to get the mobs are forming under the direction of these four men, three of them former apostles. And because of this, they apostatize. They leave. They declare themselves the true church, and so the High Council in Kirtland has them all excommunicated. Now, because of this, one thing that happens, they have to shut down the printing press that is there. They've been printing their monthly magazine or newspaper. That shuts down, and shortly after, the mobs burn the press building down. They destroy the whole thing. Threats are sworn out against Brigham Young, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and others, and it gets bad enough that in early 1838, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon flee to Missouri to escape the mobs. They're only able to get into, I believe, into Indiana before the money runs out. But while they're, I think it's fun that they ran into some trouble. Brigham Young is traveling with them because he's also under threat. And Joseph Smith, seeing that they're having difficulty, says, Brigham Young, you were called in as an apostle. You're called as a minister of the Lord. What do you think we should do? And Brigham Young thought he was joking, but Joseph says, no, I think you know what to do. And so Brigham Young says, well, wait here. Don't try to move any farther without the sufficient funds. You got to wait, and God will provide. Then there was a Brother Tomlinson who lived in the area who had been trying to sell his land for something like the last year, and he couldn't get anybody to buy it. But he came to Brigham Young and told him the issue, and Brigham Young said, if you will be faithful and follow my directions, everything will be okay. Within 24 hours, he had an offer on his house and his land. He was able to sell it at a good price, and from that money, he gave Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon $300, which was enough to get them the rest of the way to Missouri. And so I find this very fun, that Joseph Smith turned to Brigham Young, and it was through Brigham Young and his gift of prophecy and his power of his priesthood that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were enabled to get to Missouri. Now, on a final note, while they are traveling to Missouri, the apostles that are already out there, Thomas B. Marsh, David W. Patton, I believe, I think there was a third one, I can't remember who it was now, but they have a kind of vote of no confidence against the presidency in Zion. This was David Whitmer was president, and then John Whitmer and W. Phelps were his counselors. And they brought them up on charges in front of the High Council. They actually went to 6 different locations in Missouri, calling the saints to gather in those areas, and they held a vote of all the people. Basically, they were calling a state they were doing ward conferences to get the voice of the people on the matter of the charges against the stake presidency. And fairly unanimously, the stake presidency is convicted and they are removed as presidents. They refuse to accept that, of course. And because of that, partly, they are disfellowshipped from the church. They will later be excommunicated as well, but I believe the excommunication happens after Joseph Smith arrives in Missouri. And Joseph Smith arrives in March, just a couple of days before we get section 113. So that is where I'm going to end this historical review.